Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm meteorologist Mike Ottenweller, and you have tuned into your Alaska weather, brought to you by NOAA and the National Weather Service. Thanks for joining us on this last day of February, the 28th, 2018. As always, you can get in touch with us, 1-800-472-0391. We'll get you to any of the offices, and you can talk to a forecaster directly with any questions or comments you have. Weather.gov/Alaska will take you around the region to Fairbanks, Juneau, or Anchorage, and you can get the information you need. And at nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov is our email address to get in touch with someone here directly at the TV desk. Well, quite a bit to talk about, so let's jump right into our headlines. First of all, winter weather will continue for the West Coast. Things have quieted down across Southwest and much of South Central and even Southeast to some extent. But for the West Coast, things remain very active, so we'll get into the hazards that are in effect for that area. Cold offshore flow is going to be the name of the game for South Central and Southeast Alaska, as we have strong high pressure in place, pushing those cold offshore winds through the gaps. And so those of you near those gaps, you'll be experiencing that or already are experiencing that. And then as far as those gaps and the terrain around them, they expect some pretty significant turbulence for the next, at least 24 hours or so, as aviation interests should be aware of that through those areas. And then snow is going to return to southern mainland this weekend. Southwest will continue to see clips of it, but for the rest of southern mainland towards Cook Inlet and over towards the Copper River Basin, that's where we expect more snow this weekend. So on into our map now. Let's start off down here in South Central and Southeast. We do have two high wind warnings. This one down here through Thompson Pass in Valdez. Gust in between the 70 and 90 mile an hour range, higher up, higher in the pass, higher gusts, higher up in the pass. And then over here, Taku winds moving through Juneau and much of the area down there near the downtown area and through southeast Alaska. And those are the one for South Central into Thompson Pass is in effect until 7 a.m. on Thursday. And the one for Juneau area is in effect until 11 p.m. on Thursday, and that is winds 60 to 65 miles per hour for the gust. Now off to the West Coast, and as you can see here, a fairly wide swath of winter weather products. We'll start off with our advisories down here, just south of the Seward Peninsula for the Norton Sound there. And generally, these are winter weather advisories for a few inches of snow and some gusty winds up to about 50 miles an hour. Most of these in effect until midnight or so Thursday or into early Friday morning. So looking at those for at least about another 24 to 36 hours. Check with your Fairbanks office for the latest on those local advisories. Then up towards the northern portion of the state here in the Kotzebue Sound along the Beaufort Sea coast. This is where we have a variety of either blizzard warnings or winter weather warnings. Most of these are blizzard warnings, looking generally between 4 to 7 inches of snow and about 60 mile an hour gust. Most of these are in effect until about midnight on Thursday again, and this includes the Baldwin Peninsula, Selawik Valley, those places. You can expect those strong winds and falling snow leading to blizzard-like conditions, which is a quarter-mile visibility or less. So do be careful if you're traveling anywhere out in those areas. All right, well, let's get into our satellite loop now, and as you can expect, pretty active along the west coast there. Plenty of these high, cold cloud tops pushing in there into the west coast. This is where our ridge of high pressure is in place, and that is allowing that moisture just to ride up and into that ridge, but it's not making much eastward progress, so therefore just really affecting the coastline, just clipping southwest Alaska, but more up towards north of the Kuskokwim Bay and up towards the Seward Peninsula area. Let's look at that again here, and you can see generally that cyclonic rotation here, and then the counterclockwise, the the cyclonic rotation here, anticyclonic here, as I get my highs and lows straight, and then you can see the southerly flow coming up in between those, bringing all that moisture with it. For those of you in southeast Alaska, our area of low pressure is finally starting to pull away. Still have some lingering clouds, but you can start to see some dry air moving off the interior portions of Canada and from the Dawson and Northway area starting to pull into this. So we do have some showers continuing out over the Gulf, but really that cloud cover is moving away, and we're starting to see just the effects of that cold, dry air moving through the gaps. And then up for south central Alaska and up through the interior portion of the state, pretty quiet weather for you all, just clear and cold with some gusty winds moving out of the north. So how does that look on our surface map? Well, our biggest story again is going to be along the west coast, where we do have plenty of moisture moving up courtesy of this frontal situation. So we're going to have kind of a combination of a warm front, and then the cold front is never really going to make it too far to the east. So what that means is we're going to have a lot of blowing snow with cold air feeding into this system from the mainland with this high pressure in place. Cold air blowing that air, the blowing snow out towards the sea, and so that will continue to be the story through the evening hours. Not a lot of snow reported yet through the interior portion of the state, but we do still see that blowing snow starting to take effect near Cape Romanzoff and the Hooper Bay area. Out towards southeast Alaska, our area of low pressure pulling away, so still some blowing snow there through the passes of the Alaska Range and through the passes near Thompson Pass. Also some pockets of snow showers still continuing up near White Pass, but the majority of the precipitation is wrapping away, and you can still see that kind of hit or miss cloud cover underneath these precipitation bands, and that's really that cold air moving out over the warm water, leading to some shower activity. How's that look going into tonight? Well, very similar conditions there. Strong offshore flow, more of an east to west wind, so that Taku wind event will continue through the overnight hours tonight. And just kind of this building trough off the mainland there. It's dry, but it's being a result from the cold air meeting the warm air over the water, so you get a trough of lower pressure. That low will continue to move away and just leave the conditions very similar for southeast Alaska. Meanwhile, we'll start to see our frontal system approach ever closer to the western portions of the Capes and for western Alaska. Some rain mixing in as you get out over the central Aleutians, but for the most part, this system will remain snow and start to see temperatures warming up towards freezing, but expecting this to, again, to remain snow, with blowing snow being the primary concern. Showers behind it with plenty of cold air wrapping in off the Kamchatka Peninsula, coming back in on the back side of this system, and that will continue on into Thursday as we see more cold air wrapping in behind it. Here we still have our snow showers and rain down towards the Alaska Peninsula, but mainly snow and blowing snow continuing for the west coast as this frontal system approaches. Not going to see a lot of inward movement with this system. The high pressure really remains in control, so just some cloud cover there, stretching out towards the central portion of the state. And then again, offshore winds and not a lot of precipitation for southeast Alaska. On into Friday, start to see that gradient come down a little bit. Those lines of pressure are opening up, starting to see that improving the wind conditions. Winds should start to taper off there by Friday. And then again, by Friday, as we mentioned in the headlines there, start to see some snow creep back into southwest Alaska and eventually towards south central Alaska for the weekend. The snow should lighten up, and the wind should also lighten up along the west coast as that frontal system does fall apart. How about for our temperatures? Well, generally for southeast Alaska, for tonight's lows, you can expect generally in the low 20s to mid 20s where the cloud cover continues. A little bit colder up there towards Chilkoot and White Pass and Yakutat as the skies clear. Out over the mainland, clear skies means cold temps this time of year, near minus 30 degrees up in the Tanana Valley, generally around 0 for southern Alaska, and there our warmest temperatures will be along the west coast there, with temperatures climbing or staying in about the 10-degree range. On into Thursday afternoon, temperatures generally going to be in the low to mid 30s for southeast Alaska. Trying to approach the minus 15 mark here over the interior portions. Starting to see some of that warming effect towards southwest Alaska with temperatures climbing up near 30 and then into the mid 40s for the Aleutians. Not a lot of change, pretty cool temperatures again Friday night for southeast Alaska. Generally a little bit colder over the eastern portion of the state and warmer for the west. And then wrapping things up on Friday afternoon, pretty cold temperatures return for the west with generally near 30 for southwest Alaska.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
All right, so let's take a look at your aviation weather now. And as you can see here, Thursday morning, again, that area of high pressure dominating over the interior portion and central of the state. And so we have most of our active weather here along where that moisture is riding up the side of that ridge, and a frontal boundary is hung up here along the eastern Aleutians, or eastern Bering and down into the eastern Aleutians. So IFR conditions expected along that front, and then just some NVFR conditions hugging along the north side Alaska Range, just over the Yukon Valley, and then up there along the northern portion of the Brooks Range. Spotty IFR embedded in there as well. For southeast and south central Alaska, VFR conditions are going to be the rule both Thursday morning and Thursday afternoon. And then again, you can see that dry air really holding firm, keeping that IFR and MVFR conditions there centered out over the west coast and off through the eastern Aleutians and the eastern Bering. Another swath of MVFR back here with some low stratus hanging in, keeping ceilings down. And as we get into Friday morning, a ridge of high pressure holding strong over top of the central portion of the state, and so thus most of our IFR conditions continuing just through Bristol Bay, starting to make their way towards the Alaska Range. But this ridge will hold strong of one small pocket of MVFR conditions towards the interior portion of the state, but otherwise that fairly widespread IFR area along the west coast, and then off towards the Aleutians. Our next area for Friday and Friday afternoon, we'll start to move in IFR conditions expected to develop for the western Aleutians. That MVFR area and IFR area starts to break apart a little bit as it runs into this ridge of high pressure. So just a smaller swath of IFR there for Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, and then a few small areas there towards the Kuskokwim Bay and up towards the Seward Peninsula, MVFR across the northern portion of the Gulf. So you'll see that reflected here in all the past maps. Mostly going to see VFR condition, visual flight rules, Adigan and Anatuvik, Lake Clark and Merrill. The trend continues for rainy. How about windy? Same story there. Isabel, visual flight rules. Mentasta is the only one that's going to start out with some low-level moisture, so keeping them marginal visual flight rules should be improving through the day to visual flight rules as drier air works in. Tanita, same story. Portage, visual flight rules, and Chilkoot and White, visual flight rules as well. So let's take a look at our freezing levels now, and you can see again where that high pressure is centered over the state, pushing colder air offshore and keeping that clockwise flow around it. So it's pushing that colder air, keeping the surface line right along the northern Gulf, and then a little bit further south down towards Kodiak Island. Our warmest air coming up the western side of that ridge up to about 8,000 feet. As you get off towards icing maps now into Thursday afternoon, towards the west coast here, that's where we can see fairly widespread isolated moderate icing, so not anything too heavy, but it is fairly widespread. Plenty of moisture to work with coming up the western side of that ridge. So above 10,000 and then dropping to about 3,000 here as you get up towards the Chukchi Sea. Over towards southeast Alaska, I'll slide this way so you can see as that low pulls away, it still has an area of isolated moderate above 3,000 feet there. Fairly widespread, but it is starting to make its way away from the coastline. And then our next area above 5,000 feet associated with the system that is inbound into our domain. So how about our jet stream? Well, this is where you can see how meridional our pattern is. We call this a ridge trough couplet because every ridge then has a trough on either side of it. And so that pattern would continue for infinity, basically, as the weather and the fluid dynamics go, coming in at about 140 knots from the northwest and then driving up through the Bering, supporting that front, 125 knots, 130 knots, and then diving back down over the ridge, 130 knots, helping to aid that offshore flow, and then coming up and around this area of low pressure that is starting to move away from the state. Small addition of an Arctic jet there at 75 knots, helping to keep things moving out of the north. How does that look at 9,000 feet? Well, there's our strong southerly winds in support of that front, 40 to 50 knots. They're all along the west coast out of the south. It's more of a west to east flow across the Bering at about 20 to 40 knots. And then let's not take for granted this strong northerly wind, 50 to 55 knots offshore flow from 9,000 all the way down to 3,000, 45 to 50 knots, blowing through those bays and passes, so helping to create some very bumpy turbulence through the channels there and out of the terrain, even coming out of Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound. Fairly light conditions over the interior portion of the state, but it's once you get back towards the Seward Peninsula, there we have those southerly winds returning even at 3,000 feet, coming up about 50 knots, and then again a little bit more west to east, and you can see that front reflected there in our 3,000-foot winds. So what does that mean for turbulence? Well, that's kind of the big story here. We can expect fairly widespread, considerable moderate below 4,000 for southeast Alaska with those strong offshore winds. Similar story here for south central below 6,000, and then along our frontal boundary here over the west coast is our below 6,000 considerable moderate. Out over the Aleutians below 4,000 feet is our next area, so fairly widespread turbulence. Stay tuned.
Technology. It's the rhythm of our everyday life. We're more dependent on satellite and communication systems than at any other time in history. Disruptions can affect our economy and even our safety. To prepare for the effects of such events and minimize impacts, we need to look outside our atmosphere, some 93 million miles away, at a star we call the Sun. It's our main energy source. It warms the Earth and grows our food. While the sun and the space between may seem pleasant from our perspective, it's anything but peaceful. At its surface exists a chaotic state of eruptions and radiation. And unlike Vegas, what happens at the sun doesn't stay at the sun.
Space weather is essentially emissions from the sun, radiation, magnetic field that erupts from the solar surface, pumped out into space, sometimes right towards Earth. When it impacts the Earth, it impacts our technology. That's what we call space weather.
These solar events and their effects at Earth can disrupt systems we take for granted. From causing blackouts to the power grid, to delaying offshore drilling operations due to inaccurate GPS data. Interference with communication systems can force air traffic to reroute and impact rescue response and coordination. Outside our atmosphere, solar radiation can harm astronauts and the systems they depend on. The good news is that these eruptions can be detected early. Forecasters at the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, have their eyes on the sun at all times.
The Space Weather Prediction Center is part of the National Weather Service and is very much like a normal weather forecast office. We're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're looking at data, we're looking at imagery, we're looking at model outputs. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches of imminent activity to our customers so they can take action.
In many ways, forecasting space weather is a lot like forecasting hurricanes. Those who rely on space weather forecasts, like electric power grid managers, are informed early on and can begin taking protective action.
When we see an eruption on the sun, space weather forecasters will issue a watch. This is much like a hurricane watch. When a hurricane sits offshore of Miami, for example, perhaps 48 hours out, we too can see way in advance that something may be coming towards the Earth.
As the storm moves toward us, it hits a monitoring spacecraft orbiting 1 million miles away from Earth.
It's kind of our buoy sitting out there offshore, and that hurricane, about 30-45 minutes before it makes landfall, we'll get the measurements from the buoy. That's what this spacecraft does for us. That big eruption that left the sun hits the spacecraft. Now we've got the measurements of exactly what's going to impact us here on Earth, and we issue the warnings to give the power grid a heads up that the storm is now imminent. An interesting element to this whole process is that when the forecasters issue the alert, the power grid receives the alert, takes the necessary actions to protect the grid, and the average citizen never knows anything ever happened.
The number of customers who rely on space weather information continues to grow. As our reliance on technology increases, so will our need for constant monitoring of the sun.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
GPS has changed society. Most people don't realize how remarkable and how many different applications there are.
The GPS has become an integral part, not just of our daily lives as far as cell phones and guidance for our cars and mapping, but the whole system in agriculture is really relying heavily on high accuracy GPS.
So they're using GPS to plant those seeds with centimeter accuracy. And then they can come behind it and irrigate and fertilize right where that seed is with that 1 centimeter accuracy.
The GPS creates a line for the operator that he can steer along, or you go to another level and the operator doesn't steer anymore and the tractor has an automatic steering system on it, much like a cruise control on a car, except for when I push the button, it doesn't drive a set speed. When I push a button, it stays on a predefined line.
You don't even need lights. You can do it at nighttime. You program your GPS and it's driving that tractor for you. So it's huge, and it's changing the way that the farmers farm the fields.
6 or 7 days out.
There's an interest in GPS applications from space weather side because when the sun is eruptive, it causes GPS to falter, and in some cases it doesn't work at all.
Productivity may suffer to a certain degree in that there's no way that I as a human being can steer as good 8 hours a day as a GPS system's going to do. It's going to be the same all day long. Some of the other application technologies, those are going to be gone. We're not going to have the ability to do good section control on sprayers and planters and fertilizer applicators without GPS.
We see a huge growing customer base in so many different industries, so many different sectors now relying on GPS and high precision GPS. They're all big customers for us.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And time now for your marine weather, and as you can see here, the sea ice has started to grow a little bit with this cold pattern that we've had just for a little while. It started to grow again, so we have high concentration here around St. Lawrence Island, but it is fairly thin ice, some marginal there onto the north side. As we see those winds along that front shift out of the south and push that warmer air back up into this area, we do expect the ice to once again retreat, start to deteriorate along the edges, and that thin ice will probably start to break up there near St. Lawrence Strait. So be aware that that ice is probably not going to last all that long, that new ice that has grown. Let's dive now into our marine forecast for southeast Alaska, and as we've been talking about with those strong gusty offshore winds, you can see that reflected there in Lynn Canal. Northerly winds 40 knots and gusting up to 55 knots, seas up to 11 feet. There towards Stevens Passage, you can expect east-northeast winds at 35 knots, gusting all the way up to 65, and then down towards Sumner Strait and Clarence Strait, 25 knots out of the northwest, seas at about 5 feet. Towards the open waters, still gusty conditions through there as well. West of Gustavus, expect winds out of the northeast, 50 knots, gusting up to a 65. Yakutat, northeast winds, 45 knots. And then down towards the southern portions of the outer waters, generally a north or northeast wind, 30 to 35 knots, about 14 to 16 foot seas with those winds. Starting to see things calm down a bit by Friday. Still some gusts there, though, for Stevens Passage at about 60 knots out of the northeast, and generally sustained 35 gale force winds there. 7 foot seas down towards the Clarence Strait and Sumner Strait. Expect northerly winds 20 knots, gusts to 40 and 5 foot seas, and then up towards Lynn Canal, 35 knots out of the north and 7 foot seas. Out over the open waters, generally anywhere between about 15 and 25 to 30 knots out of the north or northeast, and seas are going to be on the order of 9 feet. As we get towards south central Alaska, again, gusty conditions through Prince William Sound, out into the from the Copper River Delta through the Cordova area. Gusty conditions there up to about 45 knots, and seas on the order of 6 to 9 feet. As we get a little bit closer towards the Cook Inlet region, more of a northeasterly wind, not quite as gusty, 25 to 30 knots there, and out towards the southern portion of the Barren Islands, expect 30 knots out of the north and seas 6 to 7 feet on Thursday. For Friday, things calming down a little bit. Northwest and northeast winds here near Prince William Sound, 10 knots and seas 2 to 3 feet. And then towards Cook Inlet, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots, about 6 foot seas. And then as we get towards, 3-foot seas, and then as we get towards the Barren Islands and south of the Seward Peninsula, 10 to 15 knots out of the northwest seas, 3 to 4 feet. For Thursday along the Alaska Peninsula, expect fairly variable flow, northeast winds near the northern portion of the peninsula, but then a little bit more confused here towards the south side of Kodiak Island, north 25, 8-foot seas, but then becoming south near that front, 15 knots, and seas about 5 feet. Out towards the eastern Aleutians and the western Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 30 to 35 knots and about 13-foot seas. On Friday, expect generally an east or northeast wind, 15 to 30 knots, all the way up to 35 knots here south of Sand Point, and seas building from 3 up to 11 feet. For the Aleutian chain, you can expect southwest winds around the backside of that low, but near the front here, southeast, becoming westerly, anywhere between 20 and 35 knots, and seas are going to be on the order of about 10 up to 17 feet. And then on the chain on Friday, you can expect more of a west to southwest direction, except right here along the front, northwesterly, 25 to 40 knots, and seas anywhere between 9 to 10 feet along the north side and about 10 to 12 feet south of the chain. Off towards the west coast now, southeast winds along the coastline, except southwest a little bit further offshore, 20 to 35 knots, and generally ice covered, except down near the Pribilofs, 12 to 13-foot seas, all the way up to 21 feet there on the highest swells. And then by Friday, expect to see things become a little bit more southerly and southwesterly, anywhere between 20 and 25 knots, seas ranging from 7 feet near the ice edge up to 13 feet a little bit farther off. On into Thursday along the Arctic coastline now, expect that southeast wind at about 45 to 50 knots right there along the Kotzebue Sound, and then along the Wainwright area, 25 knots out of the east, and then east or west wind, Prudhoe Bay and Kaktovik, and generally 15 knots. Easterly wind takes over along the Arctic coastline, 25 to 30 knots on Friday, and expect a generally southerly wind over the ice pack, 25 to 30 knots along the Kotzebue Sound. So again, our main weather maker is going to be this front, a host of winter weather warnings and winter weather advisories. Check your Fairbanks office for the local data on that. And then along the Thompson Pass and Juneau area, strong northeast winds creating high wind warnings for tonight and in through Thursday. So be aware for those areas. Thanks for joining us. Hope you have a great night.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.